To Civo Navigate. It's first time in Europe, and it's great to see you all here in the room today at the brewery in London. And we're going to talk today about data centers, something that came into my personal radar a few years ago, but from an open technology perspective, is something that we focused on for COP26 at Open UK. We had one of the biggest events in tech at COP26, an Open Technology for Sustainability Day. And next week, in fact, in Edinburgh, we're going to do a 2-year follow-on to see where we got to in our commitments. And the thing that we looked at for that as our own sort of personal company project was data centers and how we could build a more sustainable data center model for the future using open technology. And what we did was we built a blueprint, and in that blueprint, we brought together open source software, hardware, data, and it looked like we could reduce emissions by about 70%. Now that was a staggering figure, but one of the things that our work on data centers caused me to do was to read up a lot on data centers and emissions. And of course, whatever we're doing in life, everything we do today in a digitalized environment is via apps, via our phones, via compute. And as my 8-year-old nephew, who's now 12, got me interested in sustainability by telling me that this was his world and his future and I should be looking after it, which he's quite right about. But then he said to me, but I'm a gamer, Auntie Amanda. And we had a long conversation about being a gamer and what that meant. And of course, being somebody in a digitalized world, every transaction, every compute that we make has an impact on society. And in many ways, what we've seen is the demonization of data centers over the last couple of years. One of the problems, of course, is how do we measure? How do we measure the outputs of data centers? How do we see that shift from data center badness to data center goodness? And in this panel session today, we're going to talk about all of this stuff. And we've got 4 real experts on the stage. I wouldn't count myself as an expert when it comes to data centers. And I'm going to ask you each to tell me a little bit about what you do and what your passion is around data centers and the work that your organization does. And Dinesh, if it's okay, I'm going to come to you first.
Absolutely. Hi again, everyone. So past life, I built a data center up in Stevenage. So it was a conversion of a warehouse into a full data center and doing all of that work. So we were really fortunate in sort of 2008 that we were able to build it with, at the time, like the most up-to-date technology on things like cold air containment, which is an absolute essential now, and most data centers have been converted to do that. But that's where I really got my intro into data centers, about efficiency, a bit of fluid dynamics, about how air moves around a data center and where to put aircon units. But now, as my role in the CTO in Civo, it's really, really important to us when we're choosing sites, we're choosing partner data centers as well, about how they're deploying data centers, how they're deploying kit into data centers, where the power is coming from. And as we announced today, our partnership with Deep Green about doing things differently and really challenging the status quo is what we're really, really excited about doing.
You know, there's a bunch of stuff to unpack, even just in your intro. And I think that the thing that immediately had bells ringing for me was when you mentioned a warehouse in Stevenage. And one of the things we really looked into in our blueprint was this concept of empty space, bringing the data center nearer to the end user, using edge computing, still trying to reduce emissions, trying to recycle existing buildings that weren't necessarily purpose-built and how those could be used. And then taking the outputs and putting those outputs back into the local community. And we looked at things like, I know in the Netherlands, they heat greenhouses. In Scandinavia, I think there's like lobster farms. And Mark, you know where I'm going with this, swimming pools.
Yes, so I'm Mark Bjornsgaard, I'm the Chief Executive of Deep Green. We, as you say, we are heating swimming pools with data centers. And it was we're really energy folk and we've become data center people. But I think 7 years ago when we looked at the space, we just found it fascinating and amazing that so much of the world's electricity supply was going into these huge barns in the middle of nowhere and then being forcibly ejected, usually with millions of gallons of water. So at that point, Microsoft, to their absolute credit, had written a paper in 2011 that coined the phrase data furnace. So that's what the journey we've been on for the last 7 years, is trying to figure out how, to be honest, the physics and the engineering was the kind of the fun, easy bit. The difficult bit had been previously was getting people to accept that they might want to come and use a data center that didn't look and feel like a normal data center.
Yeah.
So, but I think we're getting over that hump now.
And that phrase you said Microsoft coined, I missed it, the second word.
Data furnace.
Data
So
furnace.
this idea that computers, you can harvest the heat from computers, and that's both what Mike's doing and what we're doing, and we can be incredibly efficient about that. And the reality is, in the world, there's not enough electrons to go around.
Yeah.
So we're going to have to. The data center itself, regardless of really whether it cares about the carbon issue, actually there's just not enough, and there's not enough electricity to not do this, really.
Yeah, well, I guess everybody on this stage and probably in this room cares about the carbon issue. I personally spent the end of my summer in Asia speaking at an event over there and meeting some people. And one of the conversations I had there, which I was really shocked by, was in Japan. And in Japan, what they said to me was, we don't have enough electricity. So IoT, we're really interested in it, but we're really nervous about it. And actually, you can't do things like tap cards there. There's a whole load of stuff that they are reticent to get into because all of it's requiring more power. And that, even in the sort of sophisticated environments like Japan, is a concern. Where are we going to go with the global south and that? So we're going to have some big issues and challenges to deal with here. Mike,
yes.
You two work together. Can you introduce us to a bit more about what you do?
Yes, so sort of a similar background to Mark, I suppose, but another fork, another way of tackling the same problem. I suppose the observation for us was that some time ago, you've got this huge amount of energy that's going into data centers, and then it kind of all ends up as heat. And like Mark says, it gets vented. And so it almost seems like madness, that we don't try and use that energy in some way, particularly when heat is, fundamentally useful. And a huge amount of the energy in the UK is spent on heating things. So connectivity's improved, the way we can deploy workloads is changing and becoming more efficient, and it means we can think differently about that problem. Now it's possible to, I suppose, take a quick step back. It's really hard to move heat. So if that's your goal, you want to reuse it, it's really hard. You've often got to dig up the ground, you've got to put in insulated pipes. And so that idea exists, but it often doesn't happen for all those reasons. But with the changes that have happened over the last 5 years or 7 years, now it's possible to move the data to where the heat's needed. And so that's our sort of one of our core principles. And rather than swimming pools, we're looking at domestic settings. So we take a server from a data center, we repackage that, we attach it to domestic hot water cylinders, and then that acts as the heat sink. So we use the energy twice. We use the server for our compute, and we pay for that electricity. And then the household who hosts the unit benefits from the heat that we transfer into their water, so they get free hot water.
Right, interesting. And all of this, of course, needs measured. John, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and what it is your company does?
Yeah, sure. Just want to say Mike's company is a really, really cool idea. The idea of distributing servers across domestic situations and otherwise. It's really, I've heard about it, thought it was a really cool idea. So looking forward to hearing more about that. Where Green Pixie really differentiates from that, we're more of the data than the data center itself, and we largely work on the data available from the public cloud providers. So AWS, Microsoft Azure have these ledgers that essentially catalog every behavior an enterprise takes in the cloud. And what we do is take this data, which is all the variables you need to give full emissions transparency to enterprise, often FinOps softwares as well. There's a big intersection there if anybody intersects with that space, which opens up a really interesting opportunity, which is essentially through optimizing the cloud, software engineers can begin to actually reduce emissions from behind their laptop. And I think that's probably why I resonate with Mike's company. It's like using the distributed effect of work that people are already doing in order to reduce emissions at source. So the electricity that is being used when software engineers are using these instances and servers in data centers, as well as the wear and tear of the server, that can be estimated in terms of emissions, and that is what Green Pixie does. And was going to put in a stat to start things off. 2% of global emissions is estimated to be what data centers are using currently, and that puts it on par with the aviation industry. And because it's so esoteric and conceptual, and we're behind our laptops, we don't see this issue, but essentially, this can become the next big issue of the climate crisis. By 2040, some estimates put it as high as 20% of global emissions. There's a lot of factors that go into that, but that is not too far away from what could become reality. So this is a crucial conversation to be having.
I think it is. I think that data center piece, I'm actually surprised that it's only 2%. I thought it would be higher than that.
Yeah.
So I think what we're going to do, we've got roughly half an hour before we come over to the audience for questions and hope to get all of you engaged in the discussion. I'm going to run through with the panel what it is we think the challenges that the data center brings are, how we think there are resolutions that we can contribute through technology, and then how do we measure that and how do we show that we shift this conversation forward. So if we go back to sort of basics to make sure everybody in the room's in the same place, what are the big challenges that you see? Dinesh, can we come back to you?
I think you've touched on it at the start, is getting the emissions that we're producing as coders and that we're using when we're deploying software and running software in production, about getting that visibility all the way down to the feature request that's coming in at the start of we expect this feature to cost this amount of emissions or this amount of power, and if we do things differently, what impact does that have? And I think that visibility piece is going to be really, really key. And once we have that visibility, then all of the solutions that we're going to discuss can be compared against each other.
So what you, I think, are talking about is sustainability by design, but not even on the strategic data center level, actually each of us having responsibility and being accountable as we work in the tech sector for bringing sustainability into every decision we make. And I guess I've started this off by saying that I've just come back from Asia, which is bothering my conscience in some ways from a sustainability perspective, because there is no option but to fly on that particular trip. But when we look at this and think about it, there's this sort of personal accountability we can each take, and we're increasingly seeing a move, which we won't get a lot of time on this panel for, but we're increasingly seeing a move to green software development and actually thinking about better ways to code so that it's more efficient, that it's less power wasting in what we do. So I think that's part of it. But then also this whole containerization, technologies of themselves, things like Kubernetes.
Yeah, I think there was a survey, I think, last year about how energy efficient coding languages are and comparing them to each other. So, it's not something that I generally thought about until this survey came out, that, Go compared to C, compared to Rust, it's not just a preference or a knowledge question for developers, but actually you could have a real impact based on what you're coding in, which is really, really interesting. And then on the Kubernetes side, there's a load of information that we Kubernetes people, cloud native, need to be doing to provide information all the way back down through. Because I think some of the work that's doing here, creating that data on one side is great and accounting for it, but passing responsibility down to developers is what Kubernetes can help do.
Yeah, definitely. And if you don't mind me just adding to that, really the engaging software engineers in this issue is the biggest challenge we ultimately face, because the data is available when there are companies and solutions on the supply end to help those emissions. But what there is currently is a large amount of waste that is inherent with the way that enterprises and other businesses are building software, building in the cloud, storing data. I think, to speak for myself as the CEO of my own company, the pressures from up down tend to be build it fast and don't break it. That is just the business pressures we deal with, but we need to grow past that and start thinking, what can we clean up? Was there any instances that are still left on that we no longer use? Could we be doing this more efficiently? And the best thing, there is a big business case for this, because there's a large correlation to cost savings. It's just that it's difficult for companies to get around to doing it. So incentivizing developers to reduce emissions through or reducing cloud waste for emissions is something that we're really trying to be the flag bearers for.
I think that's probably something we won't have much more time on today, but if it is something that anybody in the room wants to follow up with, there's a lot of work going on around specific languages and around good practices and processes, and I know that's going to be covered off quite a lot next week at the Open Technology for Sustainability Day. But if I bring us back to data centers, Mark, the challenges of data centers, if you were to sum that up in a big picture way.
Yes. So you mentioned 2% of energy is data centers. Actually, more than that is the transmission networks. So one of the major benefits, or one of the biggest challenges that the conventional industry has got, is that it is actually in the wrong place. So if you can keep the noughts and ones in a geographical area, then you actually save a ton of carbon, probably more than in any other sort of instance. So that's one very good reason why the traditional industry sort of struggles. But the other unknown within the conventional industry is scope 3, because it's all very well to offset the energy that's going into the computers in a data center. But
I might stop you there actually and just say, do you want to explain scope 1, 2, and 3? Because I don't know the sort of...
So scope 1 and scope 2 are really, think of that as the energy that a company uses. And there are all sorts of aspects to that. But scope 1 and scope 2 are the kind of the energy that you're using as a business. Scope 3 is the embedded carbon, the embedded energy in the stuff that you have as a business. And of course, for a data center, that's enormous, because the embedded carbon in the compute is an enormous proportion of the overall carbon budget. So one of the challenges, and frankly, one of the not so good things about the current industry is that when they talk about sustainability, but they're actually really just talking about scope 1 and scope 2. So that's the energy they use. Whereas actually the problem that we see as we needing to fix, not least because carbon is already $75 a ton and almost certainly will be $200 a ton by the time we're all taxed on it in 3 to 5 years. So what we're trying to do is get ahead of that problem within the current industry and say, you've ultimately got to figure out how to offset the carbon in the machines themselves. And taking that responsibility, saying, addressing that and saying we're actually going to offset and try and solve that. So using the existing buildings means that you don't have carbon in the existing buildings. Making sure that compute lasts for longer, so extending the lifetimes of computers. So there's a bunch of things that progressive data centers are already doing to try and address that scope 3 bit.
And a good analogy that an advisor of ours goes to is if you think of a pint of Guinness, scope 3 is the Guinness and the froth is scope 1 and scope 2. And enterprises have now just started looking at scope 3 seriously. Due to regulation that's hitting at the end of the year in the EU and extending globally. It's definitely the lion's share of where we'll be saving the emissions from, and the electricity on top of that. It's still a large part.
So if I said that I understood it as scope 1 and 2 as sort of being you and your business, and scope 3 is getting more into your supply chain, is that right, or is it a step beyond that?
The scope 3 is really everyone is upstream, so it's coming into you. So it's the choice of the data center industry is, does it want to take responsibility for its scope 3? Now, if you're an airline or an energy company and your margins are wafer thin, then your excuse is, I can't take responsibility for my scope 3 because it's such a bloody great big number. I'm going to go bust if I do. The data industry has the luxury of 50% gross margins. So the reality is the data center industry can afford to address its scope 3, and it's our assumption that we should start addressing that from the get-go.
And it's such a significant, data centers play such a significant role in our lives now, and they're going to, capacity is going to be growing massively and so on. They could be a really powerful agent of change, if we can harness the broader potential. If we can reuse the heat and we can align data centers and processing with the need for heat in society and start to figure out how we can do that effectively, then we can make a really big difference beyond just emissions. We can make a social impact, and one of our goals is to try and help people that are living in fuel poverty, support people in social housing. And so I think there's loads of opportunities. Mark, swimming pools. What about all the businesses that are using heat, and how could we start to locate the processing with them, so it could actually be, rather than just thinking about emissions, we can actually see this, data centers and this fundamental thing for our lives today could be an agent of change and positive impact in society.
So when we think about that big picture, what we're saying is we've got the data center itself, the building that it's in, the equipment that goes into it that we haven't really talked about today, and that equipment being renewable, recycled, something being done with that, reused. We've got the technology that's in there being efficient, and the power that's going in, hopefully being green and not carbon-based, all as being sort of the issues we already see and the challenges that we're trying to meet. And those are all things within the data center owner's control. So they would be scope 1 and 2, is that, or are they getting into scope 3?
Scope 3 is embedded carbon. So scope 1 and 2 is really the energy that you're using as a business. Correct me if I'm wrong, or oversimplifying it. So all of those things layer up. And like everything in the climate crisis, it is a system. And so we can't think of these things in isolation. So it is the software that's working. Make sure that we keep the zeros and ones all in the same place. Make sure the computers, all the carbon in the computers offset. Make sure we're buying renewable energy. All of this stuff needs to combine in a graceful way, in a systems way.
And to bring this into the public cloud side of things, so I'm sure a lot of people in the audience, so they do a lot of their work in AWS, Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud Platform. If you're in that situation, you kind of lose some of the ability to have control over the supply side of the data centers, and ultimately that's in the hands of the cloud providers, and they are on their route to improving these data centers. But in general, it tends to be a pretty, the locations can be extremely carbon intensive. Sustainability hasn't been necessarily considered. And where you're choosing your instances and when you're setting up is having a carbon impact based on the location of the data center. So if you were to have the ability to set up a new instance in, let's say, Sweden, as opposed to US East, you would actually be saving your company a considerable amount of emissions if that's possible. And if you were to clean up some instances which you have previously used that have been left on, or anything in terms of reducing compute, reducing storage unnecessarily, you are using less electricity, and you are wearing out the servers which these run on to a lesser degree, which also impacts the main part of the Guinness as well. So software engineers in the audience could reduce CO2 from behind your laptop. So that's where we built the company, to kind of raise awareness of that.
So what we're saying is that as developers, each individual is able to look at how they code, the languages they use, which will all have an impact on the compute power used, but also that they individually can make choices, maybe not, they can put pressure perhaps on their companies to make choices about where their data centers are going to be, and that there's a significant difference between countries, but also between providers.
Yes.
And
now
regions.
And regions in a country.
And the regions. Okay, so the challenge, I guess, that really brings forward is how do we get that information to make those sort of systems decisions for ourselves?
In terms of the public cloud providers, we provide the emissions data to and bring transparency over the emissions you're causing in public cloud, and the reductions you could potentially make by cleaning up the waste. So with public cloud providers, there is the data available to do it, but engaging with third parties such as ourselves is the way to do it. But when it comes to so the supply side, so I'm interested to hear the kind of businesses you tend to work with. Is it the forward-thinking, sustainability thinking companies?
Yeah, well, I think it's Mike's point really. ESG, it's not just carbon. I think we can get really hooked on carbon. The problem with the hyperscalers and frankly anyone in a conventional data center is that the environment, the environment bit is also water, and it's also pollution. So it's the pollution that goes into, so recycling the kit is super important. And then the S bit, which is really where we're anchored, which is actually the social good that data centers can do. It's very counterintuitive, and no one really understands what the hell a data center does. So when you say that data centers could actually be this unlock for local communities and a very different world.
It's very interesting. Because I was stuck in the E because that's my side of things, but it does go into the.
Do you want to just explain what the ESG stands for?
Yeah, so it's I don't say it often, but environmental, social, and governance. And environmental being probably the more carbon stuff you would be aware of, but that also blends into biodiversity and other less familiar ones. The social side of things is the social impacts it has from companies making decisions. An interesting intersection for data centers is there is actually, we're at the point now in the UK that residential projects are being delayed due to data centers taking up the grid, the electricity grid. So in the west of London, that has recently happened. So this issue does definitely intersect hard with the S, and in the way that Mark and others are going into the S in interesting ways is definitely something that I've learned today.
Yeah, I think just on that as well. I think typically data centers are measured on PUE, power usage effectiveness, and the target is to get as close to 1 as possible. So sort of your total power divided by the power for IT. And if that's your goal, then hyperscalers are actually doing really well, but then they're having these other secondary impacts. And so I think how we think about measurement of a data center and structure that can start to have a big impact on the decisions that are made when we look to build new infrastructure.
So I think what you're saying is this ESG piece is something that we all need to be considering as we see data centers being used and grown in the future.
Yeah, there's a carrot and stick. So CSRD came in, so some legislation came in May. So as of May, if you're running a data center that's more than 100 kilowatts, you have to report, and that reporting is a precursor towards taxation. So we're definitely all gonna, whether we like it or not.
What do you mean by that, a precursor towards taxation?
Because ultimately we're going to have to pay for the carbon we use. Depending on where you fall in the kind of spectrum of how much carbon we think we need to pull out of the atmosphere in the next couple of 100 years, reality is we need to stop putting carbon into the atmosphere. So taxation will be a mechanism by which governments force us to.
And when we say we, do you mean
everyone,
individuals?
Everyone, businesses. I mean, some individuals, we can all do our bit, but the reality is that all businesses, and I think the data center industry up until this point probably has held its hand up and said, can't touch us with kind of critical infrastructure. They're just not going to wash when sea levels are 20 meters higher than they are now. Yeah. We are all in this together, and we all need to be part of the solution. So that's
And I would just add to that, particularly almost quite a old-fashioned way of looking at sustainability would be you as an individual at home. Really, your voice in your business is probably the strongest effect you can have in sustainability, especially if you're in a compute intensive, because it's the businesses are causing the climate crisis ultimately. Individuals, of course, I think it's important to practice what you preach and have the effect, but I think it's probably an underrepresented way of doing it. Yeah.
I would potentially say as well, there's new tech around AI and ChatGPT, and I think there's a huge gap in the amount of energy that has been used to train these models that are being said are going to change the world over the next 5 years.
Yeah.
Getting them trained, keeping them running, every query that you make against one of these models, there is a carbon cost associated with that. And these are the sorts of decisions that we can start making as consumers all the way down to start impacting how businesses run inside data centers.
But we're seeing that shift so fast. So with the LLMs, large language models, one of the reasons that those have not been more widely distributed, one of the reasons that many individuals can't create their own or small companies can't create their own is the cost. And the cost is the resource plus the power, right? The
Absolutely.
Power that sits behind those. But I think we're already seeing a shift where people are starting to look at tiny language models.
And they're becoming more and more accessible to the point where you could theoretically run one on your laptop now. Whether or not you should is a different question, but it's becoming so accessible that we could have them everywhere, and it's something we would need to consider when rolling these out.
Yeah, just bouncing off that, in terms of, like, would you say that was similar to use a lighter LLM on your laptop? Is the equivalent of like you're using basically the servers and the GPUs they're using are very carbon intensive, and almost like you're overdoing it in terms of the resource that was potentially being used compared to if you were doing it locally on a lighter model. If you have any insight into that.
It's interesting because you're still going to be using a certain amount of energy to run something locally, and there are economies of scales that you can do when you run these in a data center. There are things as a data center provider that you can do that you can't do on a laptop. You're not going to strap your laptop to the side of a boiler, realistically. I don't think so.
I've put my feet.
You know, is it warmer than the dog or less warm than the dog for keeping your feet warm?
Depends how busy I am. Yeah.
So, you know, moving these into data centers and voting with your wallet of running it in a data center that is being, you know, carbon or ESG knowledgeable when they're making these decisions, rather than running it in a back office server that you've got realistically that is just pumping all of this heat out into the air.
And it's interesting when we're talking about these decisions, you know, we're encouraging everybody to think about systems thinking, to be looking at sustainability by design, to be holding their providers accountable, thinking about the statistics and the measurements that we have available to us about their use of emissions. But actually, there's another piece to this, and I think, Mark, in mentioning taxation, you sort of bring us round to thinking about that, and it's the G to some extent in the governance bit, and thinking about how we actually encourage the companies that we're measuring to shift and to be more sustainable in their actions. So I wonder if maybe we start at this end this time, if you've got any thoughts on how we do that shift, how we encourage it.
It'd be interesting to just incentivize companies to take up these more sustainable options, I think. You know, and so, rather than it being the company you use reporting and the pressure they're feeling there, is that maybe you could actually, maybe there's some, you know, a credit or for using a company in that space, or
so more of a carrot than a stick.
Yeah, more of a carrot than a stick. I think
the carrot is that it's cheaper. Actually, at the moment, it's frankly we're half the price of a normal data center because we don't have any cooling costs.
Yeah.
So actually, there is an implicit carrot in this new world.
And really, the way that we are in this is the climate crisis with sustainability is it can't just be this is good, do it. And you need to have reduced costs, some real benefits to the bottom line, usually.
Yeah.
But very close to this or a social benefit, as in Heater's case, which is then probably goes into some grant public sector side of things as well.
I think people are sort of comfy in their existing setups, so I think it's how you sort of extract them from that. You know, the message could be good, but do they really want to change? You know, everything is set up, how they like it.
We have a kind of comedy moment in most sales cycles at the moment. Now we're up stealth, which is the head of CSO is very excited about us coming to use a deep green data center, and the chief executives as well, and they get on the first call and everyone's really excited, and then we say it's great, and the next call it'd be great to speak to your CTO because they've got some great news, and for exactly that call, and then the CTO arrives on the call, it's like there's no fucking way I'm going to change this. So you have
That's
to...
funny because I was asked by one of my panelists for tomorrow if they were allowed to swear
Oh,
in
sorry.
my panel.
I swear.
Apparently you are.
But the point is we need to be kind to these people. We need to be kind to our CTO brethren because, of course, it's a non-standard, and no one gets fired for buying IBM. So this is a new paradigm.
Right.
And so we're all of us thinking about how we can make this more palatable because there is a cost sort of issue, but actually we can, if we explain ourselves well, the CTO should be as excited as the CSO.
So Dinesh, CTO.
As
Dinesh
is.
The token CTO on the panel.
How do we get
You weren't there like that.
I was just going to add that I think...
So hang on, I want to uncross the CTO's arms. So how do we uncross that CTO's arms?
Well, I was just going to say is that going to companies that have embraced Kubernetes is a really, really good place to start because the shift that companies that have embraced Kubernetes over the past 5 years is about deploying software in a way that is ready for failure, is ready to be moved around, and going to these companies first that are not attached to workload,
Yeah.
and they haven't got the one server that must always be on. Does anyone know what it does? No, but it must stay on, right? Those aren't the companies that we should go to first. We need to be going to companies that are already agile, ready to move workload at the flip of a switch, and start there because we can get workload done easily.
It's an innovation signal.
I don't know. I don't know if I agree with that. So what I'm hearing from you is that the people who are doing the right thing should have the pressure on them to do more of the right thing.
We have to signal to them. It's so new, and it's a generational shift. I think we've got to be realistic about how quickly this can happen.
And from a startup perspective, really you need to find the white hot part of the market, and it usually is the more innovative, less risk-averse companies where you can find your beachhead. But then the more and more you become the status quo, then usually the rest of industry follows. It tends to, but
Okay,
I'm
definitely going to challenge you for now. So you're saying the rest of the industry is going to follow. So the naysayers who are not adopting good technology, who are not agile, who are not using systems thinking, who are sitting there on these big old data centers using huge loads, they're the people that we need to shift most, aren't they?
the hardest nut
They're
to
the
crack.
the hardest nut to crack, but they're the ones we're going to ignore because they're too difficult.
No, we won't
We don't ignore them.
We don't
We're
ignore
just
them?
realistic about
So what do we do? Legislate? Put taxes on them if they're not?
that. All of that will
it?
help. All of that will help. That carrot and stick. So we talk a lot about crossing the chasm. There's a distribution of adopters, and you do, as you say, you focus on those early, and you give some proof points, and so you have to make that transition easy.
Okay.
And the stick is coming for the big slow ones
stick
as
is
well.
coming.
So we make the story so compelling that they want to
Quite,
shift,
yes.
and if they don't actually do it, we punish them.
Well, to be honest,
Regulation's going to do it anyway.
regulation, taxation does that.
I think though that we've got to give these companies an option,
Yeah.
and we've got to prove that it works, because that we can go to companies with a big stick and say please change, and they're going to go, I would from a risk point of view pay the fine rather than change, because this is not proven technology.
But I think that's why HETA is, and what we're doing is so important, because combined, what we are doing is giving people hope and real tangible benefit. There are real heater units on real hot water tanks. There is Exmouth Leisure Centre is being heated by a deep green unit. And I think in the climate crisis more generally, people need hope, and they need to see the manifestation of what's coming. I think that's very important.
I think once we've got further along our journeys and proven things more fully, then I think some of the big players can say, well, actually, hang on a second, that's working. I'm surprised that some of the big players aren't piling a load of money into doing this themselves. Actually, it feels like they should be. But
Something's changed in the
are.
last 18 months. Because we've been looking at this market for 7 years, and certainly, and to your point about the larger incumbents, I mean, they are now starting to call us in a way that they certainly weren't even 3 years ago. So something's definitely changed.
It has changed, and we're at a tipping point now, which is an exciting place to be.
That's it, exactly.
And I think to an extent I'm playing devil's advocate, but as somebody who didn't really introduce myself at the beginning in any depth, I spent 25 years as a lawyer, and your duty to the company and the company's duty once it's listed, once it has shareholders, is always to shareholder value. And the thing that I talk about quite a lot in terms of open technologies, but also in terms of sustainability, is how we shift that dial. Because as a lawyer, you're always going to take the easy solution, the fail-safe that gets your company to do the right thing in the simplest way. And that right thing, it's how you define that right thing. And we need to see sustainability really being part of that definition of what the right thing is. So we've got about 1.5 minutes left before we go to audience questions. Final word from each panel member, sort of 30 seconds, and what you would like the audience to take away from today before we take a couple of quick questions.
There is power in your hands today that you need to investigate and look at.
Not too dissimilarly. Software engineers actually have a big opportunity than most to reduce millions of tons of CO2. That's from behind their laptop. So that's similar for me.
Yeah, and to build on that, and to the previous point, we're not talking about a generational shift yet. Just start. I think that's really important. Start a proof of concept. Approach us. We're not expecting massive workloads yet, but it's just about starting.
and spread the word, I think, as well. I think start talking about this.
Yeah, I think that's, did you have something more to add before we?
No, I think probably covered some.
Okay. So we have, I think, 5 minutes. There's one question there. I'm a bit of a rabbit in the headlights. They're sort of designed for people who are taller than me. So if I can't see you, sort of jump. There's one back there as well. So if we can take those 2 questions.
So, really interesting panel, and I kind of want to come away with some actionable things. So there's a guy called Kardashev who had a theory of advanced civilizations, and his type 1, most basic civilization was one that could use all of the energy landing on the planet from the local star, which is a lot of energy. There was also a guy called Sturgeon who said 90% of everything is crud. And we have a lot of experience with biological systems where we see a lot of redundancy. And as civilization grows, it looks like one of those systems. So are we not inevitably doomed that almost everything we do is wasted?
Mm-hmm. I have to say, as a Scot, we're all doomed, says one Scot to another.
Yeah,
You're old enough to get the joke.
I feel at home.
I mean, if you look at it through the lens of limits to growth, like we have, as a society and as a civilization, we have blown through all the limits to sustainability within the planet we live on. So we all know this. We don't need to talk about that anymore. And it's one of my sort of pet topics is that let's stop talking about how doomed we are and actually let's just get shit done and start fixing it.
I would say that I'm actually an optimist in the climate crisis, which might be controversial somewhat, but I do think we're massively adaptable. I think we need to find a way to go from short-term thinking to long-term thinking, because if it's not the climate crisis, it'll be something else. We can't just take resources in the short term all the way through, and it's interesting to think way into the future. Are we going to have that realization? Is AI going to be smart enough to do it for us? But yeah, it's an issue that goes all the way into the future. So interesting question. Yeah.
I would just say I'm looking forward to us as a civilization building a Dyson sphere. So if we can get on that quickly, I'm all for it.
Yeah.
And a final question just there. Yeah, sorry.
So one of the questions that I had is, we sort of have focused a lot on the carrot here, like what can we do as software engineers to make things better in our own companies where we do have control. But one of the other parts of that is, as stewards of technology, we have the ear of regulatory authorities. Mm-hmm. And one example that I can think is GDPR has made a huge difference in the way that we do data protection. Mm-hmm. What would be sort of a framework for a similarly impactful climate regulation in tech as a historically under-regulated industry, or at least less regulated industry?
Under-regulated industry is an interesting phrase to be using right now when we're seeing what's coming out of Europe. Mm-hmm. You're going to be regulated within an inch of your life around security very shortly, around product liability even sooner, and sustainability. Yeah. So from a sustainability perspective, do we think tech needs regulated, and if so, how?
Well, specifically in the tech vertical, so the regulation that you mentioned, if I get it right, I believe companies over 200 employees will need to start measuring the impact of their data center use from enterprise to the data centers and to the suppliers. And that will be just a rising tide. It's coming all the way from the top. It will continue to regulate. And whether it's quick enough is another question. And it's specifically in the tech vertical, I'm not sure of any regulation on that level, unless I'm not aware of it. But I think GDPR is a pretty good example of the type of conversations that leadership and companies will be having in regards to sustainability.
Yeah, your point, Mike, that it is cheaper and better and faster and greener to do what we're doing. So actually, there is the stick of that.
The shareholder value aspect.
But actually, the reality is, with a certain lens, it depends where you're anchored. I'd probably argue that you're taking a massive risk not changing, and I think that's really, in terms of sort of regulation. I mean, in Germany, in 2025, you won't be able to build a data center without reusing the heat. Yeah. So this stuff is very real. It's very present. It's not theoretical anymore.
No, I think that's the line perhaps to take away with you today is it's not theoretical anymore. and we're all living this
We're living it.
situation, and if we don't do something which we individually can be accountable for, but also collectively and through our organisations, that things are not going to shift.
Yeah.
So I think it just remains for me to thank everybody for joining us and our 4 panellists for their contributions today. I think they're all going to be around for the rest of the day, possibly tomorrow too, if you have follow-up questions for them. I know we had a very short time for questions. If you want to follow up, particularly on the open technology piece, we have our Open Technology for Sustainability Day in Edinburgh on the 14th. You can join that for free online or in person. And I hope to see you all around Civo Navigate over today and tomorrow. Tomorrow at 1:30, I think I'm back, 1:30, 1:45, talking about open source and what its future is. So thank you for joining us.